السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا رسول الله. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. يا غريب يا مظلوم يا شهيد كربلاء. يا ليتنا كنا معكم سادتي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وعسى أن تكرهوا شيئا وهو خير لكم وعسى أن تحبوا شيئا وهو شر لكم والله يعلم وأنتم لا تعلمون. God states in the Holy Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and perhaps it is that you despise something, but it is good for you. And perhaps it may be that you love something, but it is bad for you. And God knows, and you do not know. Amanna billah, sadaqallahu al-aliyyul azim. Let us enliven our hearts and minds and gatherings with the remembrance of the Holy Prophet and his purified progeny. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin. In the philosophy of religion, there is a school or a discipline that is known as natural atheology, which attempts to discredit the essential features of belief in God. So skeptics, atheists, others put forward arguments, and through these arguments they attempt to prove the central beliefs of theists, those who believe in God, to prove those central beliefs to be false. And they present many arguments, a range of arguments. But one of the most important and one of the most famous is what is referred to as the problem of evil. What is this problem of evil? Skeptics and proponents of this thought, they put forward the following idea. They say that the world that we live in is full of evil and suffering. This is the claim they make. The world is full of evil and suffering. There's murder everywhere. People, innocent people who are killed. There is deprivation, there's poverty, extreme poverty in the world. There are natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, others, that destroy communities, take lives, destroy property. There is exploitation. People are taken advantage of. And so they present a theological challenge. They say that people who believe in the existence of God, normally, they believe that God is all good, that God is merciful, that God is compassionate, that God is benevolent to His creation. They also believe that that God is omnipotent. What does it mean to be omnipotent? Meaning He is all-powerful. He is capable of all things. So they ask the following. They say, how is it that we can reconcile belief in a good God, a benevolent God, and a God that is all-powerful? How do we reconcile that with the existence of evil and suffering in the world? It can't be, according to them, this claim, it can't be that God is both good and all-powerful. Why? They say, because if He is all good, that means that what? that means that he wants goodness for his creation. That means that he desires that they live in peace and happiness and success and tranquility. And if he is all-powerful, that means that he is capable of doing all things like removing hardship and suffering and evil from the world. So they say that if this God is able to remove hardship and evil, but he is not willing to do that, that means he's not a good God, he's a malevolent God. But if he is willing to remove hardship and evil from the world, but he is unable to do so, that means that he is not omnipotent. He is not all-powerful. He is impotent. He is incapable. This is the theological challenge that is put forward, and it's called, famously, it's known as the problem of evil. And this is used by those who put forward this argument. This is used as the Achilles heel when it comes to belief in God and the existence of God. And in fact, we find that even amongst those who are believers, we might ask this question in a different way. Sometimes we ask the following question, and that is, why do bad things happen to good people? Don't we ask this question sometimes? Why is there suffering? Why do good people suffer? A child, for instance, who is innocent. Or someone who is good. Someone who is generous. Someone who is kind. Why do they face poverty? Why do they face illness? Why do they face exploitation, oppression? Why does it happen? Many of us ask this question. Sometimes our friends ask us this question. We are people of belief, and we ask this question. We wonder about this sometimes. And in fact, this question is not new. The question, interestingly, a version of this question, the Quran tells us that the angels, they asked a similar kind of question. They asked God. When God created Adam, قَالَ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. God said, I will place Adam on the earth as what? As my representative, Khalifa. The angels, they inquired, قَالُوا أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاءِ. Are you going to put on earth someone who is going to cause corruption and bloodshed? وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِكَ وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ. But we, as your creatures, as your angels, we glorify you and we praise you all the time. God replied to them. He said, قَالَ إِنِّي أَعْلَمُ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Yes, I am going to put a representative on earth, and I am aware of what you do not know. You don't have wisdom and complete knowledge. I am aware. And so we find that across history, various philosophers and theologians and scholars, they have grappled with this question, the problem of evil, and this question of hardship and suffering in the world. And so tonight, I'd like for us to address this question, for us to think about it a little bit. But before we do so, I want to make two important points. The first is that the term evil is a loaded term, because it connotes oppression and injustice. Anytime we say evil, the thing that comes to mind is there's inherent, something is inherently evil. Something is unjust. Something is oppressive, or someone, right? But when it comes to our belief in God as Muslims, our belief in God is that God cannot be described as evil. God is just. God tells us in the Quran that He does not oppress anyone, that He does not commit an act of injustice. And so we have to start off by putting this loaded term aside, because this is how the theological challenge, this is how it's presented. It's presented as the problem of evil. But this itself is a fallacy, because it assumes there is something called absolute wrong, absolute evil. So we have to put this term aside. Instead, for the purposes of our discussion, we'll talk about hardship and we'll talk about suffering. The second point is that in no way in our discussion do I want to downplay suffering or hardship of others. We discuss suffering and we know that it's tragic and we know that it's difficult. People suffer, they die, they become sick, they're ill. They face all sorts of hardships. We don't want to downplay people's suffering or their hardships. So keeping those 2 points in mind, we can proceed and discuss this issue in 3 points, inshallah. Sallu ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. The first point that we want to discuss and think about together is that as human beings, our knowledge of existence, all of existence, the scope of existence and creation, our knowledge of this is limited in scope. The Quran reminds us. God says, يَعْلَمُونَ ظَاهِرًا مِنَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. People know that which is apparent, right? We understand that which we can see, but there are many things that are hidden from us, that we have no access to knowledge of. No matter how much we use our reason and our intelligence, we are incapable of deciphering and understanding. There are some things that are mysterious to us, they are hidden from us. In another verse, God says, وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. What you have been given, O human beings, the amount of knowledge that you have been given is what? Is only a little bit. قَلِيل. There are many things that you are unaware of. You are not able to grasp and to understand. And based on our limited human knowledge, we tend to make judgments that are also limited. We tend often to judge whether something is good or bad based on this limited knowledge. And so oftentimes we jump to conclusions. How many of us have experienced this in our life? I didn't have the full picture. I didn't have all of the information, and I jumped to a conclusion, and then it was revealed to me that I was wrong. When I figured out the whole story, I realized that I was wrong. So we make judgments with limited knowledge, and when we make judgments with limited knowledge, then we come to an incorrect conclusion, a misunderstanding. Similarly, our judgments based on this limited knowledge that we have, the scope of knowledge that we have, oftentimes our judgments of what is good and what is bad is based on our individual and very subjective perspective. It's very subjective. Yeah, there are some issues that we all agree, all human beings will agree is good. Like justice. Everyone believes that justice is good. We all agree. We all agree that injustice is bad. These are objective. We all agree. But what is it, that instantiation of what is just or what is unjust, we might disagree. Sometimes we perceive something to be good and it might be good for me, but it might be bad for someone else, or vice versa. And we often find that these subjective and very individual and personal judgments that we make of what is good and what is bad also lead us to confusion and misconception. So when we come to natural phenomena, for instance, if we look at earthquakes, look at hurricanes, look at other natural disasters, look at, the place of the sun in the universe, in the world, we find that oftentimes our judgment of these natural disasters is based on our particular perception. So for instance, an earthquake occurs, and yes, it's destructive, it destroys buildings, it destroys towns, people lose their lives, people are injured. It's destructive, no? Earthquakes are destructive. You probably don't get many earthquakes here in the New Jersey area, right? You guys don't, because none of you are agreeing. But come to California, right? You'll agree that earthquakes are destructive. Or we see it on the news, right? We see the destruction of earthquakes, right? Or for instance, when it comes to hurricanes or storms, this one might be more appropriate to your context, right? Floods, high winds and hurricanes, they bring floods, they cause damage, they destroy homes, they destroy lives, property. There's destruction, right? Or for instance, we look at the sun, right? The sun, which gives us energy and it gives us light, it can also be harmful. If you spend a lot of time out in the sun, it could be harmful for your health. This is why it's always recommended not to spend too much time in the sun. If you're going out and it's hot like these days and the sun is blazing, then you put what? You put sunscreen in order to protect your body and your skin from the harmful effects of the sun. So these are harmful judgments. These are harmful aspects based on our judgment, right? Of the harms of some of these natural phenomena. But on the other hand, we can also consider some of the potential benefits of some of these natural phenomena. Yes, an earthquake may cause destruction, and it often does. But scientists tell you that there are some benefits to this natural phenomenon, this occurrence. That sometimes one benefit, possible benefit, is that when an earthquake occurs, right, it allows some of the minerals and the resources that are hidden deep in the earth to come out. And so people are able to extract those and use them for their benefit. This is one way to look at it, one possible benefit of an earthquake. Similarly, when we look at hurricanes and high winds, right? Yes, they cause floods. Yes, they cause some destruction, but there are potential benefits as well. Again, if we go back to California, you guys should all visit California, inshallah. You'll understand these examples much better, right? For those who have visited, you'll notice that California, especially Southern California, on the east side of Los Angeles, for instance, there is a mountain range. And on the west side is the coast. Now, because the population of Los Angeles is so big and people are always driving cars, oftentimes you'll find that there's a layer of pollution that gathers. And because it's trapped by the mountains, it remains. And so it's above the city. Sometimes the air quality is very unhealthy, right? And we find this in other places as well, right? Oftentimes, you'll open your weather app and it tells you that the air quality is unhealthy, especially for sensitive people. One of the benefits of high winds and rain is what? Is that it clears some of this up, right? So there is a possible benefit. Similarly with the sun, yeah, it's harmful, it has UV rays, it can cause, God forbid, skin cancer and other illnesses and diseases, but it is necessary for us to live. We can't live without the energy and the sun and the heat, the energy and the light and the heat that the sun gives us. So we make judgments based on a particular perception that we have. And we tend to forget that when we discuss good and bad, there are two sides to the story. Sometimes there is good from one perspective, sometimes there is bad from another perspective. And we have to understand that when we examine individual events, because this is often what we do. If you'll bear with me, this is often what we do. I think of a particular individual event and I judge that event or that instance as good or bad. So I see that there is a child who is ill, who is sick. I see someone who is murdered, right? I see a particular situation, an instance, and I judge that particular instance as being bad, as being harmful, right? Whereas if we look at the bigger picture of creation and of existence, we find that these individual instances and examples that we judge to be good or bad, they are part of a larger picture. They are part of a design that God has designed that includes causes and effects that links the past and present and future. And sometimes we are unaware of the bigger picture. It's very much like someone who's traveling. You go to a town, you're traveling to a town, you're not familiar, and you pass by a building that is being destroyed, right? And you think to yourself, man, that's terrible. Why are they destroying this building? Right? Whereas you don't know, as a traveler, as someone who's just passing by, you don't know what they're up to. They might be building a hospital, for instance, in its place, right? Because we only have a limited scope. We're taking one particular item and we are judging that item often out of the context of the larger picture and series of events. So we have to be very cautious when it comes to our perceptions and our judgments. Our perceptions and judgments are in many cases not just limited, but they are also very subjective. As I mentioned, sometimes what I think is good for me, what I presume to be good for me might be bad for someone else, and vice versa. What is bad for me might be good for someone else. Sometimes I am unaware. I believe something is good for me, but in fact, in reality, it's bad, or vice versa. I believe it's bad for me, but in reality, it's actually good. And this is what the Quran tells us. God says in the Quran, وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. It may be that you despise something, but in fact, it is good for you. وَعَسَىٰ أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ. It may be that you love something, you desire something, but in fact it is bad for you. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. And God sees the bigger picture. God is aware. God has wisdom, limitless and infinite wisdom. And you, O human beings, are unaware. You're limited. I read a story once about a man, this was several years ago, many years ago. A man who, he's Egyptian in origin, but he worked as a school teacher in Bahrain. And so he was living in Bahrain teaching. So the school was on holiday, so he decided to go back to Egypt to visit his family and his friends. So he went to Egypt, and he's spending time, that vacation, with his family and friends back home. And he had booked a flight to get back to Bahrain on the very last day, the last flight on the very last day, in order to get back, so that he can get back to work the next morning. And he tells the story. He says that I went to the airport in Cairo, and I was getting ready to check in, to get my bags, to go and to board the flight so I can get back home. And for those of you who have traveled to some parts of the Middle East or other parts of the world, or even some of the airports here in the United States of America, you know that it can be, travel sometimes can be very chaotic. The experience at airports can be very chaotic. So he says, I went to the airport, and first the security line was long, it was going out to the street. I went through security slowly until I reached inside. Then I had to go and I had to check in. And the computer wasn't working, right? And it was delaying. And then after that, as I was checking in, they told me, oh, your bags are overweight. You need to empty some of your bags, or you need to pay a fine. I can't empty my bags. Go and stand in another counter in order to pay the fine for your excess baggage. And then I did this and that. They told me, now you have to go and you have to pay an exit fee. Go and stand in line, pay exit fee. He says, I was getting frustrated. I went all the way until I reached passport control. Passport control told me you have something wrong with your passport. He said, I began to yell. I became very, very upset because I was going to miss my flight. And indeed, he says, I missed my flight. He says, I was furious. I was angry. Because this means that there are no longer any flights that are going to get me to Bahrain on time, so that I can get to work. I have to be at work next morning, early in the morning. And because I'm a foreigner, they're going to be very harsh with me. They're not going to give me a good time, an easy time, right? And so my boss is going to fire me. If my boss fires me, I'm going to lose my home. If I lose my home, I'm going to lose my family. If I lose my family, I'm going to... He says, that's it. The world was over for me. It's over for me. He says, I was really upset. I went home. And I was so upset that I went to bed. He says, then, a short while later, says my family member came and suddenly awoke me. They shook me awake. Get up, get up. I said, what is it? I said, come to the living room. Says, I went to the living room and the TV was on. He says, I looked at the TV and I saw the headline that my very flight, the flight that I was supposed to be on, the Gulf Air flight from Cairo to Bahrain, it was flying, and midway it fell and all of the passengers died on board. Imagine. He says all of that anger and all of that rage. He says, suddenly, I smiled big. I said, whoa, I could have been on that flight. I would have probably been dead. God saved me. God protected me. God says, what? God says, وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. It may be that you despise something, you hate it, you pray against it, but it in fact is really good for you. And vice versa. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. God knows, we're unaware because we're short-sighted. We see that which is only immediate, that which is only relevant. Now, in this situation, let's take this example, because I'm sure some of you are thinking to yourself, well, you know, almost 200 passengers, they died, one person was saved. Right? Almost 200 passengers died, one was saved. Right? And this example brings me to this point. And that is, our perceptions of good and bad are subjective. For that man who was saved, this incident was good, because he was saved. But for those who passed away, and their family members and their friends, this was bad. Can we call this act absolute good or absolute bad? It's based on our judgments, based on my individual benefits and harms. And so oftentimes we make these judgments based on limited knowledge, and we make these judgments based on subjective good and subjective bad, benefits and harms that are subjective to ourselves. And so we have to realize that our knowledge is limited, our perception is limited, dear friends. We don't know. We only see a small piece of the puzzle. God is aware of the entire puzzle, the entire series of events. And this is how the universe and the world operates. It operates according to divine wisdom, a wisdom that in many ways we are unable to grasp and understand. So this is the first point. The second point that we have to keep in mind regarding this issue is that simply that life is a test. And this is not a cliche, brothers and sisters. We often say this and we repeat this. Life is a test, life is a test. This is the reality of our lives. God brought us into this world as human beings in order to try us and in order to test us. That is the objective of why we are here. And the Quran tells us, أَحَسِبَ النَّاسُ أَن يُتْرَكُوا أَن يَقُولُوا آمَنَّا وَهُمْ لَا يُفْتَنُونَ. Do people think that they will be left in this world to claim that they have belief and they have iman and they are good without being subject to test? وَلَقَدْ فَتَنَّا الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. God says, all the generations that came before you were tested and tried by God. All of them. No one comes into this world and lives in this world without being tested and tried. No one. Absolutely no one. Without exception, dear friends. This is a rule for all of us. And so we find that sometimes the hardships that we face, the difficult tests that we face, what do they do for us? They give us an opportunity to grow. It's very much like when we're in school. You know, you progress through your grades in school, elementary education, then high school, then you go off to college and so on and so forth. And in every single level, in every class, in every grade, you are what? You are tested. Why do teachers test us? Is it because they're trying to be annoying? Some of them, yes. But why do they test us? They test us in order for us and for them to realize whether we are worthy of passing, whether we learned or not, whether we are worthy of going on to the next stage or not. No? God, He tells us, yes, it's great for you to claim iman. You say, I'm a mu'min. It's the easiest thing to say, I believe. It's the easiest thing to say, I submit, I'm good. But God wants to test us. وَلَقَدْ فَتَنَّ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. God says, أحسب الناس أن يتركوا أن يقولوا آمنا وهم لا يفتنون ولقد فتنا الذين من قبلهم وليعلمن الله الذين صدقوا وليعلمن الكاذبين. So that it becomes apparent who is genuine, who is real, and who's just making a claim. It gives us an opportunity to grow. It gives us an opportunity to move forward in life. And if God intervenes in every single detail, then this defeats the purpose of the test. I remember when I was much younger, in middle school, not too long ago, but long enough. I remember when I was in middle school, we had a teacher who used to teach us health. At the time, he was an old man, very, very pleasant, beautiful man. He was amazing. So kind, so caring, so patient with us. It was a great teacher. He'd always care for us, you know. And so oftentimes, you know, with a little bit of complaining and whining, his heart would break for us and he would give us what we want. And some of the students, not me, some of the students, they would take advantage of this. Right? And so I remember that sometimes he would give us an exam. He's our health teacher. He gives us an exam. Says, okay, you have a test. Take your test. And we'd be in class and, you know, we'd look at the exam and some of us would face a little bit of difficulty. We don't know the answers. We may not have studied. And so sometimes we'd complain, oh, Mr. I won't mention his name. He passed away. May Allah bless his soul. Oh, Mr. So-and-so, I don't know if you taught us this. This is really tough. I'm not understanding this question. We'd whine and complain, and his heart would break for us. And so sometimes accidentally he would lend us the teacher's book that would have some of the answers. Now we as students, we would be very happy. That's great. We have the answers, put them on there, get an A, we're done. But when we reflect upon this later on, you think to yourself, well, that defeated the whole purpose of the test. To give you the answers and to give you the key defeats the whole purpose of the test. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought us into this world in order to test us. And that means that we will face some hardships. That we will face some difficulties in this life. And these hardships, in many ways, they serve as a wake-up call for us, dear friends. I mentioned this a few nights ago. I said that it's often easy to get preoccupied and completely immersed in the stuff of our life. Our relationships, making money, business, school, work, kids, all of these stuff. We get preoccupied, we get fully immersed in it, and sometimes we become heedless and we forget what our ultimate objective and goal is in life. And sometimes the hardships that we face, they do what? They serve as a wake-up call. I gave the example a few nights ago of rumble strips on the highway, right? Rumble strips on the highway, what do? It's so if you're texting and driving, and none of us have done that ever in our lives, and we drift, what happens? We drift out of lane. Those rumble strips, they remind us and we go back in our lane, right? Maybe the equivalent of rumble strips here in New Jersey is potholes, right? I don't know, do you guys not pay taxes? The whole point is to do what? It's a wake-up call. Wakes you up, right? It jolts you. Sometimes this is what hardships do. We are in a severe state of forgetfulness. We forget, we are immersed in our physical and material lives. We forget our objective. Sometimes we are jolted with a hardship. This is why oftentimes we find this in our lives. That when we face hardship, many of us, because of this hardship that we face, we then turn to God. How many of us? When we face hardship, suddenly we remember, oh, God exists. Let me turn to God. Let me purify myself. Let me fix things. Let me correct my ways. Just yesterday, one of the brothers, younger brothers here, he was describing to me some of the challenges that he was facing, right? With school and work and all of that. He says, I got to a point, I faced so many roadblocks that I got to a point where I just kind of gave up and I said, you know what? I'm going to put matters in God's hands completely. We turned to God. And God what? God opened up doors. We turned to God. That hardship gives us the ability to correct our ways, brothers and sisters. It's an opportunity for us to correct. It's an opportunity for us to grow. It's an opportunity for us to remember. This is what the Quran says. وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا إِلَىٰ أُمَمٍ مِّن قَبْلِكَ فَأَخَذْنَاهُمْ بِالْبَأْسَاءِ وَالضَّرَّاءِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَضَرَّعُونَ. God says the nations and the generations that came before you, sometimes we sent hardships their ways, loss, difficulty, hardship their ways. Why? So that they can return to us, because they had completely forgotten about God. God was no longer relevant in their lives, and God wants to draw them back and remind them of their objective, that they turn back to God. This is what hardship does to us sometimes. And importantly, dear friends, when we talk about tests and trials and hardships, it's important for us to remember that God, this sounds counterintuitive. But the hadith, the traditions, they tell us that the more God loves a person, a believer, the more they will be tested. The more they will be tested. And the greater the difficulty of the test will be. This is counterintuitive. Because most of us, we say, well, if I have iman, if I'm good, that means God should give me a break. But this is a misunderstanding of how this life operates. Yes, if it was just this life alone, we have no hereafter, we have no akhirah, we have no reward and punishment, no accountability, then that makes sense. But God tests us, and God, to the degree that He tests us, He also rewards us. And Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, one of his companions, he says to him that the greater you are in iman, and the greater that you have devotion and loyalty to God, the greater that you should expect the trials and the tribulations to come your way. So he tells him, prepare yourself. And what we need to do is not wish away our problems and hardships, because this is impossible. This is impossible. It's impossible that we will not be tested. What we need to do is to be able to develop our nafs, our soul, our minds, our faith, our iman, so that we are able to overcome the test. So that if we get knocked down, we stand back up. This is what it means to have iman. This is what it means to have dependency on Allah and strength in Allah. So God recompenses and God rewards. Nothing goes beyond God's accountability and understanding. This is the lesson that Ashura teaches us. This is what Imam Hussein alayhi salam says. With the tragedy, he turns to God and he says, my Lord, what makes this tragedy a little bit easier for me to accept and to be able to understand and recognize is that you are watching, my Lord. Is that there is accountability. I know that you will recompense me for this calamity and for this tragedy and for this hardship. So this is number 2. And finally, the last point, very briefly, number 3, is that much of what we call bad and the suffering and hardship that we face and others face in this life, much of it is due to our own wrongdoings and our own actions. God says, مَا أَصَابَكَ مِنْ حَسَنَةٍ فَمِنَ اللَّهِ وَمَا أَصَابَكَ مِنْ سَيِّئَةٍ فَمِنْ نَفْسِكَ. The Quran says, when goodness befalls you, this is from God. But sometimes when evil or hardship or suffering befalls you, this is because of your own actions. It's easy for me to blame others for the problems and for the bad, right? But how much of it goes back to my own actions? Sometimes we create our own storms through the kinds of relationships that we develop. We don't care to develop good, strong relationships based on iman, based on goodness. We develop relationships based on other things, and we talked about social relationships a few nights ago and some of the things that we keep in mind, right? We engage in some behavior and interactions without thinking, without processing, right? And then when the negative consequences, when we face the negative consequences, we cry and we weep and we complain. I've created my own storm. I caused this situation with my own hands. And then I complain about the negative consequences. Much of what we do in life has to do with that. When we don't take time and effort to consider our actions, our interactions, the consequences, right? When it comes to much of the hardship and the suffering that we see in the world today, we see unjust systems, unjust political systems that exploit people. Much of the poverty that we have in the world today, much of that poverty is why? Because there's corruption. There's political corruption. There's financial corruption. People are corrupt. They take advantage of others. They use resources. They exploit people. They exploit places. Because there's economic corruption. Much of the losses that we see, it's what we do with our own hands as human beings. Even when it comes to many of the illnesses that we face. You know, we live in a strange time. Some of the illnesses that we face today, and we might not even be completely aware. Our lifestyles, how we live, the kind of food that we eat, right? All of that processed food, all of the fast food, all of the junk food, all of the other kinds of food, right? The way that we don't maintain healthy bodies, right? All of the other substances that are around us, our use of technology, all of these, radioactivity going around, if we can see what's happening around us, right? And we're not even sure of the effects of all of this on us. Some of this is affecting us. It's affecting our bodies. It's affecting our genes. It's affecting, our very DNA. It's affecting everything about us. It's causing illnesses. It's causing sicknesses. It's causing all kinds of cancers and other illnesses, right? And some of this, what ends up happening, it gets transmitted to other generations as well. And so much of the illness and the sickness that we see, it could be of our own doing, of our own lifestyles, of what we do. And then we blame others. We say, well, this is God. Why is God evil? Why is God not intervening? Because it's much of the actions that I do and the systems that we live in. So we have to keep this in mind, dear friends. When we think about what is good and what is bad, we understand that we are limited in our perception and judgments, that our judgments can often be subjective. Without complete information and complete knowledge, we have to recognize the place of trials and tests in our lives and in the lives of humanity. We have to recognize our own faults and our own actions and the consequences of our actions. This is how we understand when we come across, with respect to Ashura, we come across the powerful statement of someone like Lady Zainab alayhi salam. Sayyidah Zainab, she witnessed all sorts of tragedy. She witnessed the murder of her brothers, of her children, of her nephews. She was taken captive. They were hungry, they were thirsty, they were humiliated, they were paraded. And all of these experiences, it culminated in her presence in the court of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And Yazid ibn Muawiyah, he calls out, And he calls for the head of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein to be brought forward. And he begins to strike the head and the lips of Aba Abdullah with his cane. And then he turns to Zainab alayha salam. He says, كَيْفَ رَأَيْتِ صُنْعَ اللَّهِ بِأَخِيكِ? How do you see what God has done to your brother? And the Sayyidah Zainab alayha salam, with all of that iman and courage, without hesitation, she says, مَا رَأَيْتُ إِلَّا جَمِيلًا. I saw nothing but beauty. It was a tragedy, it was a travesty. She says, I saw nothing but beauty. Why? Because they fulfilled their roles. And because there is accountability. Because they will stand before their God, and you, O Yazid, will stand before your God. And all of us will have to answer. What cruelty did Yazid and his army commit? What cruelty? What greater cruelty than the murder of a 6-month-old baby? Ali al-Asghar, Abdullah al-Radi'. Imam Hussein alayhi salam is ready to go out onto the battlefield. Everyone is gone. He's lost all of his support. He is ready to go out onto the battlefield. He bids farewell to the women and children. Zainab alayhi salam, she comes to him, she says, my dear brother, before you go out, your infant son, Ali al-Asghar, he is very thirsty. He is just 6 months old, he's just a baby. He's so small, he's thirsty. He is unable to breathe anymore. So perhaps you can go out and you can bring him some water. Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, he takes his baby infant Ali al-Asghar. He goes out and he proceeds toward the battlefield. He raises him high in front of the enemies. He tells them, oh men, I know that you want me. I know that you are denying me and my family water. But you see this baby infant. He is so small, he is thirsty. What is his crime? What is his sin? Give him some water. He tells them, I am ready even to give him to you. If you fear that I will drink the water, you come and take him, you give him some water. The traditions say the enemies, they looked from afar. Some of them, they began to shake. They saw a baby. This is an infant. He is absolutely innocent. He has no crime. And so they begin to debate among themselves. And then Umar ibn Sa'd, he turns to his archer Harmala. He tells him, oh Harmala, end this dispute among my army right now. Harmala says, I saw Aba Abdullah al-Hussein holding his baby up high. I noticed, I looked, I saw that I could see the neck of the baby. So I took my arrow, I took my spear, my arrow, and I pointed it towards him, my bow and arrow, and I shot towards him. Instantaneously, the arrow penetrated the neck of Ali al-Asghar in his father's hands. He began to bleed, he began to struggle. Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, he takes his hand, he places it under the neck of his son Ali al-Asghar. Then he throws the blood up in the sky. He says, my Lord, what makes this tragedy easy upon me is that you are aware, you are seeing what they did to this infant who was innocent, he has no crime. You are aware and you see what they did to my son. He then turns around. He has to go back to the camp. He has to face the women and children. What is he going to tell his sister Zainab? What is he going to tell the child's mother, Rubab? What is he going to tell the rest? As he is going back to the camp, the women, they come out. They assume that this child has been given water. Instead, Aba Abdullah presents to them this slain infant. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. صلى الله وسلم عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. صلى الله وسلم عليك وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. For the soul of all of the marhumin, mu'mineen and mu'minat, let us recite Surah Al-Fatiha مع الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد.